The blood was the problem. It always was. In the controlled bedlam of a level 1 trauma center, blood was the currency of life, and the patient on table 2 was going bankrupt. His name, according to the dog tags a frantic corpsman had cut from his neck, was Sergeant Marcus Thorne. To the ER staff, he was simply Omega, the designation for a patient of such critical military importance that the air itself seemed to crackle around him. Clara Evans moved through the chaos with the practiced grace of a dancer who had long ago memorized a brutal choreography. The beeps of the telemetry monitors were her rhythm, the sharp scent of antiseptic and the coppery tang of blood her atmosphere. 12 hours into a grueling shift, her feet throbbed and a dull ache had settled behind her eyes, but her hands were steady. They had to be. "More Oneg! Now!" Dr. Ramirez barked, not looking up from the mangled landscape of Thorne's torso. His voice, usually a calm baritone, was frayed with a rare edge of panic. "Where is it?" "We're out," a nurse called back from the blood bank refrigerator. "We've pushed every unit in the hospital. The chopper from Street Michaels is 20 minutes out, if we're lucky." Ramirez swore, a low, vicious sound. "He doesn't have 20 minutes. Clara glanced at the monitor. Thorne's pressure was circling the drain. He'd been ripped apart by an IED, a constellation of shrapnel wounds painting a gruesome picture of his final moments of consciousness. He was young, strong, and fighting with the tenacity of a man who refused to die, but his body was running out of fuel. They were pumping saline and pressors into him, a desperate attempt to trick his circulatory system into thinking it was still whole, but it was a losing battle. "It's not just the type," the lab tech said, her voice tinny over the intercom. "His chart from CENTCOM just came through. He's O negative, but he's also got a rare Kell antigen profile. K negative. We run a standard cross-match with our O-neg. He'll have a massive transfusion reaction. We'd be killing him faster." A heavy silence fell over the trauma bay, a void in the cacophony of machines. It was a death sentence. To have the universal donor blood type, but with a rare antigen that made it poison. It was a cruel, statistical joke. Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. O negative, K negative. The words echoed in her mind, pulling a memory from the fog of her exhaustion. 2 years ago, she had participated in a clinical research study at the university, a deep dive into hematological rarities. Her results had come back with a flag. O negative, K negative. The researcher had called her a true universal donor, a 1 in a million walking blood bank. At the time, it had felt like a piece of interesting trivia, a fun fact to forget. Now, that fact was staring at her from a dying man's vitals monitor. She made the decision in the space of a single heartbeat. "I'm a match," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. Dr. Ramirez looked up, his eyes bloodshot behind his protective glasses. "What?" "I'm O-neg, K-neg," she repeated, stepping forward. "I was in a study. I'm a match." For a moment, no one moved. The idea was so far outside of protocol it was almost unthinkable. A direct, staff-to-patient transfusion in the middle of a trauma? It was madness. Ramirez stared at her, then at the dying soldier, then back at her. He saw the exhaustion in her face, but he also saw the unshakable certainty. He was a man of science, but he was also losing a patient. "Are you sure, Evans?" "I'm sure," she said. What followed was a blur. A senior nurse, arguing protocol. Ramirez overriding her with a roar. A hastily prepared waiver thrust into Clara's hand, her signature a messy scrawl. They sat her on a stool in an adjacent alcove, the air still thick with the energy of the fight next door. A phlebotomist, his hands trembling slightly, slid a 16-gauge needle into the crook of her arm. She watched as her own life force, dark and rich, began to fill the first bag. The warmth of it, leaving her body, was a strange sensation, a tangible gift. She felt a wave of dizziness, but she focused on the rhythmic squeak of the pressure bag being squeezed, the sound of her blood being forced into the IV line snaking its way to Sergeant Thorne. They took 2 units. More than was advisable, but Ramirez knew he had no other choice. When they were done, a nurse pressed a thick gauze pad to her arm and wrapped it tightly. "Drink this," she ordered, handing Clara a carton of orange juice. "And for God's sake, sit here for 10 minutes. Clara nodded, her head swimming. She could hear the change in the room next door. The frantic shouts were replaced by focused, urgent commands. The numbers on the monitor, which she could just barely see, began to stabilize. The freefall had stopped. She never saw his face. By the time her head cleared, they were already wheeling him up to the surgical ICU, a mobile army of specialists surrounding the gurney. She had saved a man's life, but he remained an abstraction, a name on a chart, a set of failing numbers brought back from the brink. She was a nurse. This was her job. She finished her shift, filed her paperwork omitting the part about her own unsanctioned donation, and drove home to her small, quiet apartment, the exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight. She fell into bed, believing that was the end of it. The next morning, the knock came. It wasn't a friendly tap. It was a hard, percussive sound that vibrated through the cheap wood of her apartment door. 3 sharp raps. Official, uncompromising. She stumbled out of bed, pulling on a robe, her mind still thick with sleep. She squinted through the peephole and her blood ran cold. 2 uniformed Air Force Security Forces officers stood ramrod straight in the hallway. Between them was an older man, his hair a severe cut of iron gray, his uniform crisp and adorned with the single silver star of a brigadier general. His face was a mask of stern neutrality, his eyes like chips of granite. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath and opened the door. "Clara Evans?" the general asked. His voice was a low rumble, a sound that held an implicit expectation of obedience. "Yes?" she managed, clutching her robe tighter. "I am Brigadier General Mark Harding," he said, his eyes scanning her face with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't looking at her with gratitude. He was looking at her with the focused gaze of a geologist who had just found a deposit of some rare and vital mineral. "We need to talk about your donation." The general didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped past her into the small living room, his polished black shoes sinking slightly into the worn carpet. His escorts remained in the hallway, silent and imposing figures framing her doorway. Clara felt a primal urge to slam the door shut, to lock it, to pretend this wasn't happening. But the sheer, immovable presence of the men held her in place. She closed the door softly, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. "Please, have a seat," she offered, gesturing vaguely toward her lumpy, second-hand sofa. It was a ridiculous thing to say. General Harding ignored the gesture, choosing instead to stand in the center of the room, dwarfing her small coffee table. He surveyed the space with a quick, dismissive glance, the stack of nursing textbooks, the framed photo of her and her parents, the wilting fern on the windowsill. It was the look of a man assessing a piece of terrain, not a home. "Sergeant Thorne is stable," he began, his tone clipped and devoid of pleasantries. "The doctors are calling it a miracle. We're calling it a successful asset preservation. That success is due to you." The words, asset preservation, sent a small, cold shiver down her spine. He didn't say, "He's alive because of you." He spoke as if Thorne were a piece of high-tech equipment, a weapon that had been repaired. "I'm glad I could help," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. She was still trying to process the surreality of a 1-star general standing in her living room at 8 in the morning. "Help is not the right word, Miss Evans," Harding corrected her. "You have become a key component in a critical, ongoing medical situation. Sergeant Thorne is not out of the woods. He will require multiple subsequent surgeries over the coming weeks. Each one carries a significant risk of hemorrhage. Each one will require blood on standby. Your blood." Clara stared at him, the fog of sleep finally dissipating, replaced by a sharp, creeping dread. I can donate again. Through the Red Cross. I just need to wait the required time." Harding gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "The Red Cross is not an acceptable option. The chain of custody is too slow, the logistics too uncertain. We cannot afford uncertainty. For the duration of Sergeant Thorne's recovery, you will be placed on medical standby. We will require you to be available for donation on a 24-hour basis." The room seemed to tilt. "Available? What does that mean? I have a job. I have a life." "Your job is secondary to this," he stated flatly. "As of this morning, your continued cooperation is a matter of national security. Sergeant Thorne is a Tier 1 operator with irreplaceable skills and intelligence. His survival is paramount. We will make arrangements for you. A car will be sent to take you to the base hospital tomorrow morning for a comprehensive medical workup and to establish a protocol." It wasn't a request, it was an order. The polite language was a thin veneer over a core of unbending steel. He was telling her that her body was no longer entirely her own. It was a military resource. A spark of defiance flickered to life in her chest. "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. "General, with all due respect, no. I'm a nurse. I understand the need. But you can't command me to do this. I have rights." For the first time, an emotion flickered in Harding's granite eyes. Annoyance. The polite facade cracked. You don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation, Miss Evans. Your rights in this context are a luxury we cannot afford. Your cooperation is not optional. He reached into his coat, produced a business card, and placed it on her coffee table. A car will be here at 0700 hours. Be ready. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his escorts falling into step behind him. The door clicked shut, leaving Clara alone in the sudden, deafening silence. Her entire body was trembling. Panicked, she went straight to the one place she thought she would find sanctuary and support, her job. She called in, saying she'd be late, and drove to the hospital, her mind racing. She found her boss, hospital administrator Mr. Davies, in his meticulously organized office. The room smelled of leather and air freshener, a sterile bubble of corporate authority. Davies listened, his face growing paler with every word she spoke. He steepled his fingers, polished his glasses, and avoided her eyes. When she finished, he cleared his throat. "Clara," he began, his voice oozing a placating managerial tone that set her teeth on edge. "We have to look at the bigger picture here. Mercy General has a long-standing and very productive partnership with the local Air Force Base. They are a significant source of funding, not to mention the joint training programs that benefit us both. Mr. Davies, they want to basically imprison me," Clara said, her voice rising in disbelief. "They're treating me like a piece of equipment. Now let's not be hyperbolic," he said, holding up a placating hand. "They're asking for your help in a critical time. It's a chance to be a team player, a true patriot. Being a patriot doesn't mean signing away my bodily autonomy. I need you to back me up. I need the hospital to tell them they're crossing a line." Davies finally looked at her, his expression one of pained resignation. "My advice to you, Clara, is to not rock the boat. This is an extraordinary situation involving national security. We are not equipped to fight the Department of Defense. Go to the base tomorrow. Cooperate. I'm sure it will all be very reasonable once you're there." He stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. "I'll make sure your shifts are covered." She walked out of his office, the sterile air feeling suddenly suffocating. She wasn't just being pressured by the military. Her own employer was helping them load the gun and press it to her head. She was completely, utterly alone. The next morning, the black sedan was waiting outside her building at 6:59 a.m. Feeling trapped, defeated, and with a sense of profound dread, she got in. The drive to the base was silent. The hospital inside the gates was a world away from Mercy General. It was efficient, cold, and quiet. There, she was introduced to Colonel Eva Rostova. Rostova was everything Harding was not. She was warm, her smile was disarming, and she spoke with the gentle, reassuring cadence of a trusted family doctor. She led Clara to a comfortable consultation room, offered her coffee, and spoke to her not as a subordinate, but as a colleague. "Clara, may I call you Clara?" she began. "I want you to know how deeply we appreciate what you did. You are a true hero." The praise felt like a trap. "What we're proposing here," Rostova continued, her tone empathetic, "is simply a way to ensure we can provide the best possible care for Sergeant Thorne. Think of it from a clinical perspective. Having a dedicated, perfectly matched donor on site eliminates countless risks. Contamination, clerical error, delays. It's the gold standard of care." She pulled out a file. "We ran a full genetic workup from the sample taken during your donation. It's not just your blood, Clara. Your bone marrow, your plasma. You're a 1 in 10 million match. A perfect biological mirror. If his condition worsens, if he develops a plastic anemia from the trauma, a bone marrow transplant might be his only option, and you would be his only hope." Rostova leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "As one medical professional to another, you know the duty we have to our patients. To withhold this level of care, to allow a man to die because of inconvenience? It's unthinkable. It could even be seen as a form of professional negligence." It was a masterful performance. She was using their shared profession as a weapon, twisting the Hippocratic Oath into a cudgel. She was framing Clara's fundamental human right to say no as a selfish, unprofessional act that could endanger a patient. It was sophisticated, insidious, and it made Clara's blood run cold. This was no longer just pressure, it was psychological warfare. Clara found a reservoir of strength she didn't know she possessed. She looked Colonel Rostova in the eye, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am not his doctor, Colonel. I am a private citizen who gave a gift, freely. You are asking me to become a living medical supply, and the answer is no. Rostova's smile didn't falter, but it lost all its warmth. I see. That is your final answer? It is, Clara said, standing up. I'd like to go home now. The drive back was as silent as the drive there, but the air in the car was now thick with unspoken threat. Clara felt as though she had walked across a tripwire. She spent the rest of the day in a state of high anxiety, jumping at every sound, checking the locks on her door. The other shoe she knew was about to drop. It arrived 2 days later via certified mail. The envelope was thick and bore the seal of the Department of the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Inside was a document dense, with impenetrable legalese. It was titled, Notice of Required Cooperation and Cease and Desist Order. It was an astounding work of legal fiction, citing obscure clauses from national security acts and public health emergency statutes. It ordered her to cease and desist from any actions that could endanger her viability as a critical biological resource. This included leaving the state, engaging in any high-risk activities, or failing to report any changes in her health status. It concluded by strongly advising her to reconsider her posture of non-cooperation before the government was forced to pursue more compelling legal avenues. It was nonsense, a cannonball of intimidation fired directly at her, and it was terrifying. She was reading it for the 10th time, trying to make sense of the threatening word salad, when another knock came at her door. This time, it was the local police. 2 of them. One was older, with a weary, disinterested look. The other was young, puffed up with the self-importance of his uniform. Ma'am, we received a call requesting a wellness check, the older one said, his eyes flicking around her apartment. A wellness check? From who? Clara asked, her heart pounding. Came from the Air Force Base. Said you were a key witness in a federal case and were showing signs of emotional distress. Said they were concerned for your well-being. It was a blatant, transparent lie, a tactic designed to harass and intimidate her under the color of law. They were using the local police as their errand boys. I am not emotionally distraught, Clara said, her voice tight with anger. I am being harassed by the United States military. Are you going to help me? The young cop smirked. Harassed by the military? Ma'am, we're just here to make sure you're okay. You seem a little on edge. He was deliberately dismissive, treating her like a hysterical woman making up stories. They asked a few more condescending questions, made a note on a pad, and left, leaving her feeling violated and powerless. The very people she was supposed to call for help had just become another instrument of her torment. The final, most vicious blow came a day later. Her best friend, Jessie, another nurse from the hospital, sent her a link with a one-word message. What the fuck? Clara clicked it. The URL was for a local, hyper-conservative news blog called The Patriot Standard. The headline, emblazoned over a grainy photo of her taken from her hospital ID, was brutal. Exclusive. Local nurse refuses to help wounded Special Forces hero. Her breath caught in her chest. She read the article, her stomach churning. It was a masterpiece of twisted facts and malicious lies. It painted her as a selfish, un-American monster. It mentioned an anonymous source inside the military who confirmed that a decorated Green Beret's life hung in the balance, and that his only hope was a local healthcare worker who has refused to provide further life-saving donations. The article was filled with patriotic rhetoric about supporting the troops, and ended with a question: when did basic human decency and patriotism become optional? The comment section was a cesspool. What a selfish witch. Hope she needs help one day and someone just walks away. Typical liberal. Hates our troops. Someone should post her address. Let the community tell her what they think of her. Fire her? A nurse who won't help save a life? She felt physically ill. They had taken her one good deed and weaponized it, turning her into a villain in her own story. The smear campaign was ruthlessly effective. The next day, her neighbor, a sweet old woman who always asked about her shifts, turned away without a word when she saw Clara in the hallway. At the grocery store, she felt eyes on her, heard people whispering. A text from a colleague at work asked if it was true. Her world was shrinking, the walls of her life closing in, suffocating her. They had successfully isolated her, painting her as a pariah. She spent 2 days in her apartment, the blinds drawn, afraid to go outside. She felt broken, defeated. They had all the power, all the resources. They had the law, the hospital, and now public opinion. What did she have? On the 3rd day, huddled on her sofa, she was scrolling through the hateful comments when a memory surfaced. Jessie, her friend, had once mentioned her cousin, a lawyer who did pro bono work for veterans. A guy who, in her words, absolutely hated government bullies. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary. Her fingers shaking, she found the number and dialed. A gruff, tired-sounding voice answered. "Carter." "Hello," she began, her voice cracking. "My name is Clara Evans. I got your number from Jessie. I need help." She told him everything. From the chaos in the ER, to the general in her living room, the police at her door, the article burning up the internet, she expected him to be skeptical, to treat her like she was crazy. Instead, the longer she talked, the quieter he became. When she finally finished, choking back a sob, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. She could hear the faint sound of him tapping a pen on his desk. "Miss Evans," Ben Carter said finally, and his voice was no longer tired. It was cold and hard, like ice. "Where is my office? I want you to come down here right now." They thought they could bully a nurse. They picked on the wrong person, and they're about to find out they picked on the wrong lawyer. For the first time in over a week, a sliver of hope cut through the suffocating darkness. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, and he sounded angry. Ben Carter's office was the complete antithesis of Mr. Davies's sterile corporate suite. It was a cluttered, chaotic testament to a life spent in the trenches of the law. Stacks of case files threatened to overwhelm his desk. The walls were covered in faded maps and framed commendations from his own military service, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and righteous indignation. Ben himself was a man who looked like he'd been hewn from the same rock as General Harding, but life had weathered him differently, carving lines of empathy instead of authority around his eyes. He listened to Clara's story again, this time in person, making sharp, precise notes on a yellow legal pad. His anger was a palpable thing, a low-burning fire that seemed to warm the chaotic room. "This is classic overreach," he growled when she was done. "They're using national security as a cudgel to smash civilian rights. They think because you're one person, you'll just roll over. We're not going to let that happen." For the next 2 days, they worked. Ben filed a flurry of motions, sent blistering letters to the local police chief and Mr. Grade, and Anwan Davies, and put in a call to a contact he had, a formidable Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at a major national newspaper. He was building a fortress of legal and public accountability around Clara. His strategy was simple: drag their shadowy intimidation campaign into the bright, unforgiving light of day. His actions forced their hand. General Harding, through his legal counsel, requested a final meeting, a chance to resolve this matter amicably. "It's an ambush," Ben warned her as they walked towards the sterile conference room in a downtown federal building. "They're going to try one last push. Emotional, legal, whatever they've got. Don't say a word unless I cue you. Just stay calm. Remember, we have the truth on our side. They just have power." The room was cold, dominated by a large, polished table that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. On one side sat General Harding, his face an impassive mask. Colonel Rostova, her warm demeanor replaced by a cool professionalism, and a sharp-suited military lawyer. Harding began, dispensing with any pretense of politeness. "Mr. Carter, Miss Evans, let's be clear. We are not backing down. The mission requirement has not changed. Sergeant Thorne's life remains in a delicate balance." He slid a thick folder across the table. "This is our final offer. We are prepared to provide Miss Evans with a generous compensation package. 7 figures. Full relocation to a city of her choice, a new identity, lifetime medical care. In exchange, she will agree to place herself under our medical supervision until Sergeant Thorne is fully recovered. It's a gilded cage, Mr. Carter, but a comfortable one." Ben pushed the folder back without opening it. "The answer is no." Harding's jaw tightened. "Then we will proceed with our alternative. We have a signed declaration from 3 of the nation's top military surgeons stating that Miss Evans is the only viable medical option to save Sergeant Thorne. We will petition a FISA court to have her declared a material asset vital to national security. We will detain her. We will win." It was the ultimate threat. A secret court, a rubber stamp, and she would simply disappear into their system. Clara felt a wave of nausea. But then, Ben gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was her cue. Clara took a deep breath, drawing on a well of anger and dignity she never knew she possessed. She had been their victim for long enough. Now, she would be their adversary. She looked directly at General Harding, her voice quiet but ringing with clarity in the silent room. "General," she began, "the first time you came to my home I was scared. The second time you sent your doctors and lawyers, I was intimidated. When you put my name and my face on the internet and turned my life upside topsy-turvy, I was heartbroken. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. But you made a mistake. You thought you were dealing with a resource, a bag of blood with feet. You never bothered to see the person. I am a nurse. I took an oath to do no harm, but before that, I was a citizen, and before that, I was a human being. I gave my blood freely, as a gift from one human being to another who was dying. It was an act of compassion. Her voice grew stronger, imbued with the power of her conviction. You took that gift and tried to turn it into a debt. You twisted my compassion into a weapon to use against me. You didn't come to my door to thank a citizen. You came to claim an asset. Sergeant Thorne is a hero worth saving, but the America he fights for, the one I believe in, is one where you cannot chain a person to a hospital bed and harvest them for parts, no matter how important the cause. That is a line you do not cross. That is the principle I will not sacrifice. Not for money, and not for fear. Silence hung in the room, thick and heavy. Harding stared at her, a flicker of something surprise, perhaps even a grudging respect in his cold eyes. Ben Carter broke the silence. He calmly placed his own thin folder on the table. That was the moral argument, General. Here's the practical one. He opened it. We have documented every phone call, every visit from law enforcement under false pretenses, every threat, veiled and direct. We have a sworn affidavit from Miss Lord Evans detailing Colonel Rostova's attempts at medical coercion. We are filing a federal lawsuit tomorrow morning against the Department of Defense, you personally, General, the City Police Department, and Mercy General Hospital for conspiracy to violate civil rights, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He paused, letting the words sink in. Oh, and one more thing. I spoke to my friend, Sarah Jenkins, at the Washington Post this morning. You might have heard of her. Her last piece on military overreach won a Pulitzer. She has the entire story, the real story. The only thing she's waiting for is a quote from you. The moment you file your FISA petition, my story goes live. The headline is already written. American hero, U.S. military declares war on nurse who saved a soldier's life. He leaned back in his chair. So, you can have your secret court, General, and we'll have page 1, your call. It was a checkmate. Harding was a strategist, and he could see the battlefield with perfect clarity. He could win the secret legal battle, but he would suffer a catastrophic, unwinnable defeat in the court of public opinion. The political firestorm would be immense. His career would be over. The program that produced soldiers like Thorne would be under a microscope. He had lost. He stared at Clara for a long, hard moment. Then, he slowly closed his folder. This meeting is over, he said, his voice clipped and cold. He stood, and without another look at her, turned and walked out of the room. Colonel Rostova and the lawyer followed like shadows. They were gone. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding for 2 weeks. It was over. She had stood her ground against the storm, and she was still standing. She had won. The victory wasn't a thunderclap. It was the quiet, spreading light of dawn after a long, dark night. As Ben had predicted, Sarah Jenkins' article in the Washington Post went live 2 days later. It wasn't the incendiary headline he'd threatened Harding with, but a nuanced, powerful piece titled The Gift, which detailed Clara's selfless act and the harrowing campaign of intimidation that followed. It was a journalistic bombshell. The fallout was swift and decisive. The local blog that had smeared her, The Patriot Standard, was inundated with ridicule and accusations of being a mouthpiece for government bullies. They quietly deleted the original article and printed a watery retraction. Mr. Davies was placed on an indefinite administrative leave by the hospital's board of directors, who were now facing a PR nightmare of their own. A terse press release from the Pentagon announced that Brigadier General Mark Harding had been reassigned, a well-known euphemism for a career being unceremoniously ended at a desk in a windowless office. Clara's phone, which had been silent except for hateful messages, began to buzz with a different kind of energy. Texts from colleagues, old friends, and even strangers flooded in, filled with words of support, admiration, and awe. She was no longer a pariah. She was a hero. But the most significant echo of her stand came 3 weeks later. She was sitting in a quiet coffee shop near her apartment, trying to reclaim some semblance of her old life, when a man in a wheelchair rolled up to her table. He was gaunt and pale, his body a roadmap of scars that peeked out from the collar of his shirt, but his eyes were clear and steady. Clara Evans? He asked, his voice raspy. She nodded, her heart giving a small jolt. She knew who he was before he said it. I'm Marcus Thorne, he said. He extended a hand, his grip surprisingly firm. They only told me the full story a few days ago. What they did, what they put you through. In my name. He looked down at his hands, a deep flush of shame coloring his cheeks. I've faced some bad people in my life, ma'am. But what they did to you? It's dishonorable. It's everything I thought I was fighting against. I can't tell you how sorry I am. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. This was the one thing she hadn't known she needed, to see the man not as an asset, not as a cause, but as a person. A good person, horrified by the injustice committed on his behalf. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. No, he agreed, looking up and meeting her gaze. But it was my responsibility to make sure I thanked you properly. You saved my life in that ER. I wouldn't be here without you. But then you did something even harder. You saved my honor from the people who were trying to trade it for my life. So, thank you. The simple, sincere gratitude in his voice was the true victory. It washed away the last lingering shadows of fear and anger, replacing them with a sense of profound, quiet peace. It was the validation she needed, a final closing of the circle. In the following weeks, she found a new purpose. Ben Carter's small pro bono firm was being inundated with calls from veterans fighting the VA, civilians harassed by government agencies, patients bullied by insurance companies. Her story had resonated. People who had felt powerless now felt they had a voice. Clara started volunteering at Ben's office twice a week. She wasn't a lawyer, but she could listen. She could offer guidance, support, and the powerful testimony of her own experience. She helped them draft letters, navigate bureaucracy, and find the courage to stand up. She was channeling the trauma of her ordeal into a force for good, turning her scars into a shield for others. She was no longer just a nurse who healed bodies. She was becoming a woman who helped heal the wounds inflicted by an unjust system. 6 months passed. The chill of autumn gave way to the quiet cold of winter, and then the tentative warmth of spring. The world kept turning, and Clara's life, which had been violently thrown off its axis, slowly found a new, more stable orbit. It wasn't the same orbit as before, nor would it ever be. She was still a nurse at Mercy General. She still worked long hours, still found deep satisfaction in the simple, profound act of caring for people at their most vulnerable. But something within her had shifted. The quiet, almost timid woman who tried to avoid confrontation was gone. In her place was a woman with a core of tempered steel. It showed in small ways. She questioned a doctor's medication order when she thought it was wrong, her voice firm and her reasoning clear, refusing to be intimidated by his seniority. She fought for a homeless patient to be kept an extra day until social services could find him a shelter bed, calmly staring down an administrator concerned with billing hours. Her colleagues noticed it. They called it a newfound confidence. Clara knew it was the peace that comes from having faced down your worst fears and discovering you are stronger than you ever imagined. Her friendship with Marcus Thorne deepened. He was slowly, painfully, working his way through physical therapy. They met for coffee every other week. They rarely talked about what had happened. Instead, they talked about his recovery, her work, bad movies, and the struggles of navigating a world that suddenly felt different to both of them. He was no longer Sergeant Ghost, the Tier 1 asset. He was just Marcus, a man figuring out who he was without his uniform. And she was just Clara, a woman who had discovered the surprising weight of her own voice. One bright May afternoon, she was walking home from the hospital, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face. She passed a community center where a large banner was strung up. Give the gift of life. Blood drive today. A year ago, she might have hurried past, the words a painful reminder. But today, she stopped. She looked at the cheerful red letters, at the smiling faces on the poster. She thought of the chaos in the ER, the cold weight of the general's presence in her apartment, the hateful words on a screen, the terror, the fight, the victory. And finally, she thought of Marcus Thorne's sincere, grateful eyes. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. Her gift had been twisted, used, and fought over. It had nearly cost her everything. But in the end, its simple power had endured. It had saved a man's body, and in standing up for her right to give it freely, she had saved a piece of her own soul and discovered a strength she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The scars from her battle were there, but they no longer hurt. They were just a reminder of the price of her freedom and of the profound truth that the most powerful thing in the world isn't a general or an army, but a single person, armed with conviction, refusing to be broken. She took a deep breath of the fresh spring air and continued on her way home.